Two of the most important scenes in Stranger Things Season 5 aren't about monsters, death, or the end of the world. They aren't driven by spectacle or by supernatural stakes. Instead, they hinge on something far quieter, and that's two conversations that happen too late to prevent damage that's already been done. Both of these scenes are deeply interpersonal conflicts between two of the show's most important relationships. One is romantic between Nancy and Jonathan, the other is platonic friendship between Dustin and Steve. On the surface, these moments look completely different, but they involve different characters, different emotional tones, and ultimately lead to different outcomes. But structurally and thematically, they're doing the exact same work. In both cases, these relationships don't begin breaking in these scenes, but they arrive already fractured. The damage has been done long before either conversation begins, caused not by betrayal or lack of care, but by prolonged avoidance. What finally surfaces isn't new information, but truths that have gone unspoken for too long. What makes these scenes so effective is not just their individual writing, but how clearly they mirror one another when viewed together. Each one explores a different way people process fear, grief, and emotional distance. One does through verbal honesty, and the other does through physical violence. Yet both arrive at the same conclusion. Communication delay doesn't preserve relationships, but it erodes them. In this video, I want to examine why these scenes work so well as a pair, and how their parallels and contrasts deepen their impact, and what they reveal about how Stranger Things approaches communication, loss, and emotional honesty in its final season. These scenes aren't connected because they tell the same story, rather they're connected because they're answering the same emotional question in fundamentally different ways. I think it's best if we look at these two scenes through a 3-act structure. Act 1 will be avoidance, Act 2 will be eruption, and Act 3 will be resolution. We'll go ahead and start with Act 1. The emotional conflicts that erupt in these two scenes don't begin in Season 5, but rather they are the result of behavior that's been quietly building since Season 4, driven not by malice or neglect, but by shared tendency toward avoidance. In both relationships, the core issue isn't what's being felt, but it's what's being left unsaid. With Dustin and Steve, this avoidance takes shape emotionally. Over the course of Season 4, Dustin grows closer to Eddie, forming a bond that Steve is never directly invited into. Rather than addressing how this makes him feel, Steve chooses silence. There's an undercurrent of jealousy and displacement, but it's never voiced. Dustin, for his part, doesn't see a need to confront it either. Whether the intention on either side, the result is the same, a growing distance fueled by the assumption that the problem will never resolve itself if it's ignored. Nancy and Jonathan's avoidance is more overt, but no less damaging. Their relationship doesn't fracture through a single argument or betrayal, but erodes through absence. They spend most of Season 4 physically separated, and with that distance comes emotional deferral. Conversations about their future, their goals, and what they want from each other are postponed indefinitely. The tension doesn't disappear, it just simply waits. By the time Season 5 begins, both relationships are already strained. Dustin and Steve are still not communicating honestly. They're both carrying unresolved resentment beneath the surface. Nancy and Jonathan remain emotionally disconnected, their relationship quietly on the rocks, and this is underscored symbolically when Murray hands Jonathan a wedding ring, framing it as a sarcastic solution to problems that have never been addressed, which is a clear acknowledgement that commitment without communication changes absolutely nothing. All of this tension converges in the lab. For the first time in a long while, both pairs are forced into close physical proximity, which strips away their ability to avoid each other. The snappish remarks, the body language, and the unease between them all signal relationships that have reached a breaking point. What these scenes represent is not the beginning of a conflict, but the moment when the avoidance becomes unsustainable. And this is the foundation of both confrontations. The lab doesn't create the problem, it simply just removes the space to keep running from. Going into Act 2, this is where the eruption happens. Both confrontations are made possible by the same condition, that being isolation. In each case, the characters are placed in a life or death situation where avoidance is no longer an option. There is no escape, no distraction, and no way to postpone that conversation any longer. All that remains is honesty, and/or whatever form honesty takes when it's been delayed for too long. Nancy and Jonathan are isolated together with nothing but time and the looming threat of death. This scene removes every external pressure that's allowed them to avoid one another since Season 3. They can't leave, they can't defer, and so for the first time in 2 seasons, they finally talk. Not carefully and not gently, but honestly. They even frame it as a confession of sorts, an acknowledgement that what follows is something that should have been said long ago. What emerges isn't cruelty, but quiet resentment. Nancy admits to flushing Jonathan's weed down the drain. Jonathan admits to donating her pink sweater to Goodwill. These aren't dramatic revelations, but that's the point. They're symbols of a deeper truth, that being a pattern of silently disliking parts of one another without ever addressing them. Nancy talks about Jonathan being perpetually late, and Jonathan talks about who Nancy becomes when she's drunk. They both acknowledge how substances amplify the worst versions of themselves. And none of this is new, it's just simply being said out loud for the first time. This eruption is uncomfortable, but it's also productive. There's no yelling, no violence, no attempt to hurt one another. Instead, the honesty just brings clarity, and they realize that what has been holding them together isn't compatibility, but it's just shared trauma. And once that trauma faded, the relationship had nothing solid to rest on. The conversation doesn't end in anger, it ends in understanding. And that understanding makes it clear that the relationship, as it exists, cannot continue. The scene then cuts to Dustin and Steve, who are similarly isolated beneath the lab. Like Nancy and Jonathan, they are forced into proximity with no way out and no ability to avoid one another. But where Nancy and Jonathan turn to words, Dustin and Steve begin with insults. Their eruption starts small, little bickering and name-calling and passive aggression before finally crossing a line. Steve's breaking point when the conversation turns to Eddie. He argues that Eddie didn't have to die and that he wasn't saving anyone, and that his attempt to be a hero is what ultimately got him killed. It's a statement rooted in frustration and grief, but it lands as a direct attack. For Dustin, who's still processing Eddie's death, this isn't just insensitive, but it's unbearable. What follows isn't a further argument, but rather violence. Dustin lashes out physically, unleashing the grief and anger he's been carrying around since the end of season 4. He punches Steve, and Steve responds not with retaliation, but restraint, trying only to subdue him without causing harm. Confrontation spills through a door, and both of them collapse on the ground. The eruption burns itself out, not through resolution, but exhaustion. Steve's final words, "I'm done," aren't said in anger, they're said in defeat. He walks away, leaving Dustin alone, crying and broken, now believing he's lost yet another person he loves. Where Nancy and Jonathan's honesty leads to clarity, Dustin and Steve's honesty leads to rupture. In both cases, the truth finally surfaces, but it does not land gently. This is where Act 2 leaves both relationships. Avoidance has collapsed, honesty has erupted, and the consequences, for better or worse, can no longer be undone. Act 3 is resolution. After the eruption, both relationships are left in a state that requires time to cool. The anger has burned itself out, but nothing has quite been repaired yet. What follows isn't immediate forgiveness or clarity, but it's a moment where communication finally arrives without pressure, without defensiveness, and without avoidance. For Dustin and Steve, that moment comes as they attempt to make their way back to the rooftop to help Nancy and Jonathan. The building is actively melting, destabilized by the damage above, and there's no safe path forward. Steve, being driven by instinct and responsibility, grabs a ladder and prepares to use it to bridge the staircase so they can continue climbing. It's reckless, but it's also consistent with who Steve has always been, that being someone willing to put himself in danger for the people he truly cares about. This time, Dustin doesn't stay silent, though. He pleads with Steve to stop, pointing out that the structure isn't stable and that going up won't actually help anyone. Steve resists, still hard-headed and determined to push forward, and then something finally breaks, not in anger, but in fear. Dustin physically pulls Steve back and begs him not to do it. He's sobbing, panicked, and completely unguarded. He tells Steve that he can't lose another friend, and that he can't lose him too. It's one of the most emotionally raw moments in the entire series because it strips away every layer Dustin has been hiding behind. The resentment, the anger, the acting out, all of it gives way to the truth. He isn't mad about Steve, he's terrified of losing him. And Steve finally understands that everything Dustin has been doing wasn't rejection, it was just grief. They embrace, and that tension between them dissolves. Almost immediately after, that ladder falls, confirming what Dustin already knew. Steve would have died. Communication didn't just save their relationship, but it actually saved Steve's life. Their old dynamic is gone, but something healthier takes its place. Not mentor and sidekick, not resentment and silence, just two people choosing each other again. Nancy and Jonathan's resolution is quieter but more complicated. After their eruption, the clarity they arrive at isn't about repairing their relationship, it's about accepting what it truly was. Jonathan finally pulls out the wedding ring that Murray gave him earlier, admitting that he had planned to propose instead of confronting their problems. It's an honest confession, and it reframes the ring as what it always was, an attempt to skip communication entirely. What follows is not a fight, but a mutual understanding. They acknowledge that they still love each other deeply and want what's best for one another, but they also recognize that their relationship was built on shared trauma rather than shared identity. Losing Barb, losing Will, those experiences bonded them together, but once the trauma faded, they were left facing how different they truly were. When they decided to unmarry each other, it isn't a rejection, but it's rather self-actualization. They choose honesty over obligation, and in doing so, they allow their relationship to end without bitterness. As the ring is discarded, the room finally hardens and the danger passes. And just like their relationship, something that had been slowly dissolving for 2 seasons finally reaches its end. What really ties these two resolutions together is not whether the relationship survives, but how the communication transforms them. Nancy and Jonathan's romantic relationship ends, but they emerge as genuine friends for the first time. Dustin and Steve's old dynamic is over as well, but they rebuild their bond on honesty rather than avoidance. In both cases, the relationship that existed before is gone, and that's what allows something healthier to take its place instead. The melting building also serves as the final piece of shared symbolism. For Nancy and Jonathan, it represents a relationship that's been slowly eroding until it can no longer hold. Once it hardens, they're safe and free to build something new. For Dustin and Steve, the melting structure mirrors Dustin's emotional walls finally collapsing, forcing him to say what he's been afraid to admit out loud. In both scenes, resolution doesn't come from survival or even victory, but it comes from communication. Avoidance delayed the inevitable. Honesty finally allows these relationships to transform, but not into what they once were, but what they needed to become. These two scenes stand as the strongest moments in Stranger Things Season 5 because they engage with one of the most difficult parts of being human, that being the act of honest communication. In a show defined by monsters, other dimensions, and existential threats, it's striking that the most impactful moments arrive not through spectacle, but through people finally saying what they've been afraid to say all along. Both scenes center on relationships that are broken not by hatred or betrayal, but by silence. Avoidance becomes a form of self-protection until it quietly transforms into harm. What makes these moments powerful is that they don't suggest communication is easy or even clean. Sometimes honesty ends relationships, and sometimes it saves them. But in both cases, it reveals truth, and truth is what allows change to happen at all. Nancy and Jonathan's story shows that not every relationship is meant to last, and that recognizing this isn't failure but self-actualization. Dustin and Steve's story shows that vulnerability can feel unbearable, but that it's often the only path back to connection. One relationship ends, the other transforms. Neither outcome is framed as wrong. When paired together, these scenes capture what Stranger Things does best when it's at its strongest, that being grounding extraordinary circumstances in deeply human emotion. They remind us that survival alone isn't resolution, and that the most meaningful victories aren't always loud or heroic. Sometimes they come from the courage to speak and to listen, even when it hurts. That's what makes these scenes endure, not the dangers surrounding them, but the honesty at their center. In a story about the end of the world, the most important battles were never fought with monsters. They were fought in rooms where people finally stopped running from each other and had a conversation.